Middle-earth is one of the most well-constructed, beautifully built fantasy worlds in literature history, but it would be nothing without the people that inhabit it. Although, to be completely fair, I probably would read an 800-page novelization of just a tour of a completely empty Middle-earth. This script was kinda hard to write. Tolkien's Free Peoples have so much rich depth and development that I could probably make a full video just about each of these groups. So, you know, I've decided I'm gonna do that. So this video is just gonna act as a little primer overview into each of these different groups, who they are, their origins, and a little bit about what inspired them. I'm Jess, part-time Hobbit, and today we're talking our way through the Free Peoples of Middle-earth. Let's begin by defining the Free Peoples of Middle-earth. So they are A, fully sentient groups of people, and B, never fully fell prey to Sauron. So that rules out any monsters or beasts like dragons or trolls, as well as anybody who permanently went to the dark side, such as orcs. It's because of the Free People finally all uniting that Sauron was defeated at the end of the Return of the King, so knowing the traits and origins of these groups is super important. Although they're not categorized within the Free People, the first living spirits within Middle-earth were called the Ainur. They were created by the one god called Eru Ilúvatar, and through his guidance they sang physical creation into being and then descended down to inhabit it. The Ainur that came down into Middle-earth are known as the Valar and the Maiar, and take the role of kind of demigods or angels, and if you want to know more about either of them, I have 2 videos on the subject, so check those out once you're done here. So while the Valar and Maiar were technically in Middle-earth first, and every once in a while they did take on physical form, the first actual created people to be born within Middle-earth were the dwarves. Now, if you only know a little about Middle-earth lore, this may come as kind of a shock to you, because the elves are literally called by everyone the firstborn of Ilúvatar, but the dwarves were technically first. You see, the Valar, while divine, are far from perfect, and after creating and making the world perfect to be inhabited by these elves, some of the Valar got a little antsy waiting for them to come along. Foremost in this feeling was Aule, the Valar with great skill in crafting and blacksmithing. Now, it is super important to note here that Aule's impatience, while certainly misguided and a mistake, was never ill-intentioned. Aule's love of making and crafting was entirely unselfish. And in the Silmarillion, Tolkien writes, "For so greatly did Aule desire the coming of the children, to have learners to whom he could teach his lore and his crafts, that he was unwilling to await the fulfillment of the designs of Ilúvatar." So before the elves awoke in the secrecy of Aule's workshop, he created his own people based on the vague notions of the elves that he had seen in those first days of creation. His people turned out a little short and ill-tempered and hairy, and that is where we get dwarves. They were strong and unyielding as stone and had a great desire to learn. But because Aule wasn't working under the jurisdiction of Ilúvatar, his people lacked their own will, as well as the true spark of life called the flame imperishable that only Ilúvatar could grant. It wouldn't be long until Ilúvatar saw what Aule had done and basically called him out for creating these things both outside of Ilúvatar's chosen plan and for creating something that doesn't have its own will. Aule quickly realizes that he's made a mistake and throws himself on Aule's mercy. As for his hasty creations, Aule took up the great hammer to smite the dwarves, and he wept. And the dwarves shrank from the hammer and were afraid, and they bowed down their heads and begged for mercy. Ilúvatar halts his hand and tells Aule to look at the dwarves, who are cowering from his blow. Ilúvatar explains that they have now been bestowed with a will of their own, or else they wouldn't have protested their own extinction at the hand of their master, whom they had to obey. Aule is ecstatic, marveling at the creative powers of Ilúvatar to perfect Aule's imperfect creation, and although they weren't part of his original plan, Eru Ilúvatar accepts the dwarves as his own. Some in Middle-earth even refer to the dwarves as the adopted children of Ilúvatar. Still, Ilúvatar didn't want to totally remake his plan, so instead he put the dwarves to sleep deep in the mountains so that they could awake after the elves had already woken. It feels kind of mean to say, but the dwarves are kind of the oopsie people of Middle-earth. They're like the first pancake of the morning when you're still trying to figure out if the batter's the right consistency, if you need to add more milk, and if you need to turn down the heat on the pan. And that first one is kind of weirdly shaped and burnt, but it's still a pancake. Still, in spite, or perhaps because of this, the dwarves are one of the hardest and strongest people of Middle-earth. They're described as stone-hard, stubborn, fast in friendship, and in enmity, and they suffer toil and hunger and hurt of body more readily than all other speaking peoples. Though prone to greed, dwarves are generally pretty morally upright, unable to be swayed by the corruption of evil. All dwarves, male and female alike, are short and stocky and endowed with magnificent beards that will never be cut or trimmed as long as the dwarf has anything to say about it. Just like Aule, their creator, dwarves are immensely skilled in crafting and blacksmithing, and they've built forges and workshops deep in the caverns of their mountain cities. The dwarves are actually a bit of an anomaly in that Tolkien doesn't explain to us what happens to their souls after they die. They seem to have developed their own beliefs about it, particularly in regards to the souls of their kings and lords being reincarnated after they die, but that has never been confirmed by the wider lore. Maybe since their creation was so accidental and sudden, he, never came up with a plan for their souls and has just been procrastinating the choice ever since. Tolkien's dwarves, whilst fairly original in their portrayal, aren't a particularly new idea. Whilst creating them, Tolkien drew directly from the dwarfs of Norse and Germanic folklore. And these dwarfs were often set to be the direct antithesis or the kind of natural opposite to elves, short where they're tall and cunning where they're noble. Though these dwarfs oftentimes aren't actually evil, they'll use their skills of magic and their ability to craft in order to scheme. These legends also imply that dwarfs may be turned into stone by the light of the sun on their skin, which means that they dwell in dark caves. Although Tolkien didn't rip them directly out of myths, he probably drew from these old stories in order to craft his dwarven race. The dwarves are a study in the imperfect. Their creation story is messy and incidental, and unlike many other groups in Middle-earth, they don't rely on beauty or nobility in order to be good people. I think they're Tolkien's way of showing that not everything that's good has to be glamorous, or, all that is gold does not glitter. Despite how great the dwarves are, though, you do have to take a step back and look at the sheer environmental impact of these guys. I mean, all the smoke and fumes they would have to produce, there's no ventilation, there are no fume hoods for this. OSHA would be having a field day. And digging that deep into the heart of the mountain, you're just begging to get balrogged, and then you have to have something to fuel all of those fires, so the local forests just have to be decimated by them. Luckily, since Tolkien was a big fan of the natural world, he also had this thought and embodied his worries about the natural world in Aule's spouse, the Valar Yavanna. After seeing what kind of destructive little dump trucks the dwarves were, she came to Iluvatar in order to speak on behalf of all of the little plants, trees, and animals that she had just finished growing in Middle-earth. She worries that the dwarves' obsession with crafting and creating would lead them to destroying her natural realm. Iluvatar's like, yeah, so about that, it's actually not just gonna be the dwarves. All of the people that are coming are gonna have to make use of the natural world, but they'll be really chill and cool and respectful, I promise. To her credit, Yavanna doesn't back down and says that, yes, theoretically they'll be respectful and nice to nature, but there's also going to be a lot of evil creeping into Middle-earth, and that corruptive power may have a really bad impact on her defenseless plants and animals. Iluvatar more or less agrees, and since he already gave Aule his little guys, he tells Yavanna she can pick one of her creations to make sentient. She decides that since animals can at least run away to defend themselves, she should pick one of her plants. And thus, life is granted to a few great trees, and we find Ents. We don't quite know how much they woke up here, since in their own mythology, they were actually woken up and taught to speak by elves later on. So it is kind of entirely unclear whether Ents actually are trees that just woke up, or if they're souls that got sent down by Yavanna that now look like trees. And we're never gonna get answers on that because Tolkien himself was unsure, writing, Ents were either souls sent to inhabit trees, or else that slowly took on the likeness of trees, owing to their inborn love of trees. Either way, it seems like being Entish is kind of a state of mind. Treebeard tells Merry and Pippin, "Some of us are still true Ents, and lively enough in our fashion, but many are growing sleepy. Growing tree-ish, as you might say." So it seems we have a bit of a spectrum here, from tree to Ent, with one's level of wakedness being the defining factor. So if 0 is like full on just like photosynthesizing in the sun, and a 10 would be like that one Ent whose head is on fire while they're destroying Isengard and he dips it in the river. I'll show the scene here. I think I'm sitting at like a 3.5. Let me know in the comments where you are on that scale. The Ents are a slow-moving but formidable force, towering at over 14 feet tall and taking on the shape of whatever tree they were made to protect. At one point in their story, there were also Entwives to go with the Ents. Though their story is shrouded in mystery, it's believed that long ago the Ents and the Entwives parted ways because the Entwives needed open skies and clear sun in order to grow their flowers and vegetables. Outside of the darkness of the forest, the Entwives taught humans and hobbits the art of agriculture. Later on, Tolkien theorizes that the Entwives were probably wiped out at one point as Sauron was razing the land, but the Ents of Fangorn Forest still believe their Entwives to be simply lost and not dead. Tolkien generally believed the Ents to be one of his more original creations, although he did later realize that he may have taken some inspiration from the talking trees of George MacDonald's fairy tales. He also believes that they may have been an unconscious attack on William Shakespeare, of all people. Tolkien really was not a big Shakespeare guy, and apparently he had always taken issue specifically with the walking forest part of his play Macbeth. In the play Macbeth, the main character receives a prophecy saying, "Macbeth shall never be vanquished until great Birnam Wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come against him." Macbeth, ever the optimist, takes this to mean that he'll never be vanquished, since, you know, how could a forest walk up a hill? Shakespeare, of course, then pulls a little Uno reverse on the guy, and the enemy army takes branches from Birnam Wood and uses it to disguise themselves as they sneak up on his castle, eventually, tragically, vanquishing Macbeth. It's all very clever and wordplay-y in the smug little way that Shakespeare always is. But apparently, Tolkien read this and went, well, why couldn't the trees just actually walk? So, in a very cosmic way, we have old Billy Shakes to thank for Treebeard and his constituents. Ents are an embodiment of nature itself, an encompassment of Tolkien's own frustration with industrialization, and a way for him to give a voice to the natural world which he saw as being in peril. Yavanna's words to her husband Aule after the creation of the Ents truly sums it up. "Now let thy children beware. For there shall walk a power in the forests whose wrath they will arouse at their peril." But with those two groups out of the way, let's get into the official firstborn people, the elves. Before the sun and the moon had even been invented under the light of the freshly installed stars, the elves began to awake. The first to wake were 3 pairs of elves who woke on the shores of the Bay of Cuivennen. They conveniently married whichever elf woke up directly next to them, which is an incredibly efficient system. These 6 elves traveled throughout the Bay of Cuivennen, waking up whoever they found, and along the way inventing language and music to communicate. It wasn't long until one of the Valar, the hunter Orome, found them singing in the starlight and was immediately enthralled. The elves were immensely beautiful and powerful, and through Orome, they learned a lot about the world and its making. From the get-go, all of the Valar were pretty much obsessed with the elves, desperately wanting them to come over the sea to live with them in Valinor in peace. This call was so strong that it echoed throughout history, calling all elves to Valinor, until, at the end of the events of The Lord of the Rings, they all permanently left the shores of Middle-earth for good, in order to be in Valinor. However, this was far from a simple process. Early on, many of the elves outright refused to go in Valinor, leading to a fracturing in their ranks. The 3 groups formed would be known as the Noldor, the Vanyar, and their Teleri, and the conflicts between them and the forces of evil, as well as between these groups interpersonally, personally would shape much of the early history of Middle-earth. Elves are tall and ethereally beautiful, generally wise, and incredibly slow to age. To all of the other peoples of Middle-earth, they are utterly dazzling. The hobbits could see the starlight glimmering in their hair and in their eyes. They bore no lights, yet, as they walked, a shimmer like the light of the moon above the rim of the hill before it rises seemed to fall about their feet. Though most don't have magical powers, there is something of the divine in the elves. They become cognizant of what's going on, aware and capable of reason fairly early on in their life, but they don't actually reach full physical maturity until they're about 100 years old. And very, very importantly, they are more or less immortal. I say more or less because, of course, Tolkien would never make anything that simple. The souls of elves are immutably tied to Middle-earth. Much like the Valar, their souls will never depart from it, and if they are killed in warfare or disembodied due to grief, which actually happens a lot, their souls depart from their physical bodies and are eventually recycled into a new physical form in Valinor. Unless, of course, you just really sucked as a person, in which case you'll be floating around as a disembodied ghost for the rest of time. But for the most part, elves are ageless and immortal, their souls forever trapped within time and space. Elves are one of the people that Tolkien gets a lot of credit for creating, but creating may kind of be the wrong word. Whilst he was writing The Lord of the Rings, the concept of elves was much more small and sprightly, more on par with our idea of fairies as inconsequential little garden dwellers to delight children. However, Tolkien chose to look back into the mythic conception of elves in the Norse prose Edda, as well as the Tuatha of Irish folklore, in order to kind of restore elves to their former mythic glory and power. These myths told of creatures that were tall, immensely powerful, and devastatingly beautiful. They had close relationships with the gods of the old world, and because of this, they had some kind of primordial magical power. It was from this tradition that Tolkien crafted his elves as larger-than-life, powerful figures of fairy tale. They were the first and most powerful of Ilúvatar's people, but they were not the final word. Instead, the fate of Middle-earth was to be eventually taken over by men. Less obviously powerful than elves, but much more profoundly blessed. Men are considered the second-born children of Ilúvatar, born under the light of the brand new sun on the first day of the First Age. They were born in the Far East, but many of them migrated towards the new sun, heading west until they found the elves. But already we can start to see the very unique traits of men, as many of them stayed in the east, already being tempted by the powers of evil whispering in their ears. Many of those that stayed behind would become the Haradrim, or the Easterlings, and would stand with Sauron at the end of the Third Age. However, not all men were corrupted, and a lot of them came to the west and fought with the elves against evil, and those became known as the Edain. Those that helped the elves out were given the island kingdom of Númenor in thanks, and although admittedly the whole Númenor thing ended up a little bit tragic, the descendants of the Edain were still alive and well in Middle-earth, now called the Dunedain. Men were much like elves in physical form, but they're less beautiful and less innately wise. But their primary defining characteristic is something called the Gift of Ilúvatar. At the conception of mankind, it was said that the sons of men die indeed and leave the world, wherefore they are called strangers or guests. Death is their fate, the gift of Ilúvatar, which as time wears, even the powers shall envy. Unlike the elves, whose souls are permanently tied to the physical world, after death, the souls of men pass on outside of Middle-earth to a place that even the Valar aren't made aware of. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, if I opened a present labeled the Gift of Ilúvatar and found actual death itself inside of it, I'd be pretty pissed off, and you wouldn't be entirely wrong. Men weren't exactly always able to conceptualize the fact that they die as a gift. In fact, their curse of mortality is one of the things that the forces of evil would use to manipulate men into becoming cruel and bitter. However, because men die, because their souls are not tied to Middle-earth, men have a freedom of will unlike any of the other free people. Iluvatar says that men should have a virtue to shape their life amidst the powers and chances of the world, beyond the music of the Ainur, which is fate to all things else. In plain speak, men are the only creatures to have free will. Because their souls are not bound and governed by fate, men have the ability to shape their own short lives in a way that all the longevity and wisdom of the elves could never even consider. It's this level of freedom and unpredictability that makes them the perfect inhabitants of Middle-earth in a way that the elves could never be. Elves are a relic of a divine and storied history, but men have the capacity to shape history over the course of their thousands and thousands of lifetimes. Of course, we don't exactly need to go poring through ancient mythic manuscripts in order to find the inspiration for Tolkien's human beings. In your case, you just need to, look at the screen. That being said, I would argue that the men of Tolkien's work aren't exactly modeled after you or me. The profound drama of their lives, this constant warring between good and evil, seems much more a relic of the heroes of ancient mythic tales. I can't even remember the last time I had to choose if I would betray my birthright and stray to the dark side. I don't even know if I have a birthright. While Tolkien's men are certainly men, I think the scopes of their stories and personalities are unrelatable to most people. I would argue instead that we find a reflection of everyday man in the last group we're going to talk about, Hobbits. And the truly fascinating thing about Hobbits is that for all intents and purposes, they are men. Their origins are murky at best, but as much as we can tell, hobbits are just an offshoot of really early mankind, made small by their habits and lifestyle rather than being an entirely different species. And this would mean that they also bear the gift of Iluvatar, independence and freedom despite the fear of death, and an eventual claim to the entirety of Middle-earth itself. Hobbits are small, generally even smaller and more slight than dwarves, and they refuse to wear shoes for the most part since their feet are strong and leathery all on their own. Their isolation from the outside world has made hobbits much more timid and mild-mannered than most men, and Tolkien eloquently describes them. They love peace and quiet, and good tilled earth. A well-ordered and well-farmed countryside was their favorite haunt. But that shouldn't belittle their strength or courage. Though unassuming, hobbits have the hardiness of dwarves, the nurturing hearts of Ents, the wisdom of elves, and the bravery of human beings. Considering that, it's clear that hobbits are Tolkien's love letter to the everyman. In an interview, he said that hobbits are just rustic English people, made small in size because it reflects the generally small reach of their imagination, not the small reach of their courage or latent power. Tolkien's hobbits are just the peak of his idea that we are here surviving because of the indomitable courage of quite small people against impossible odds. I think that Tolkien used his different groups of people to explore various facets of mankind. By exaggerating certain features for elves or dwarves, by embodying different philosophies in Ents and men, he was able to write a story with all of the intrigue, drama, and force of any ancient tale. But it's hobbits that he places at the center of this story, the perfect medium of all of these traits, and a lesson to all of us that even the smallest person can change the course of the future. Let me know which of these groups you guys think you would be, because obviously we all are probably hobbits, but I also think that in my case, I have a bit of the moody drama of a Númenórean person inside of me. So, let me know in the comments. Like this video if you got to this point, and subscribe, because I put out videos almost every week, except next week. There won't be a video next week because I'm very busy, but after that we'll be back to the normal posting schedule of every Friday at 3 p.m. EST. Thank you all so much for watching, liking, commenting, and subscribing, and I hope that you all have a very happy Hobbity day.